can't save me, not after what's been done.
Then I'll burn the world trying.
They called him a ghost of the steppe. A man chasing the wind and the memories it carried.
Come back to me if the wind ever changes. Some journeys don't end where...
Don't take it off, she begged, yet the rancher did, and his hands trembled when he saw why. Montana Territory, late summer, 1878. Heat lay over the prairie like a hand that wouldn't lift. It pressed down until every breath felt earned, until even the stones seemed to sweat. The sun didn't shine it punished. It burned the world to silence, bleached color from the horizon, and cracked the ground into a mosaic of thirst. The wind, when it came, carried nothing kind. Grass rattled dry against itself, sharp as bones clicking in an empty church. The land held its secrets the way an old man holds pain tight, wordless, unwilling to let go. A hawk hung in the white sky, too tired to cry. Its shadow drifted across the dirt like a memory of flight, then disappeared into heat. Elias Boone rode through that stillness the way a man rides through the ruins of his own choices, slow, steady, without expectation of forgiveness. 57 years had whittled him down to what was necessary: bone, will, and a conscience that still refused to die. His eyes were pale, worn down to the color of old glass. The light no longer lived in them, it just passed through, same as the wind through fence wire. Lines scored his face deep enough to hold dust, scars layered like seasons. Each one told the same story. He'd outlasted something he shouldn't have. Flint, his horse, moved with that mule-boned patience of an animal who knew both mercy and exhaustion. The rhythm between them was old, older than prayer. When one breathed, the other remembered to. The ranch waited beyond a low run of hills, his patch of earth, stubborn as he was. He'd built it plank by plank, nail by nail, long before loneliness had learned his name. The fences leaned now. The paint had given up. Every board argued with the wind, and the wind always won. Elias had learned to live with that too. He had learned to live with most things. What he hadn't learned to live with, what he thought he'd buried under years of drought and silence, was waiting up ahead. At first, it was only a shape against the dead grass. A busted barrel, a splintered post. Something slumped against it, human maybe, or maybe just another trick the heat played on tired eyes. But as Flint slowed, the world clarified. Flies rose, circled, settled again. The smell hit next, copper and sun-rotted sweat. Elias' stomach went hard. A woman lay by the post, hands bound in front of her, wrists swollen where the rawhide had bitten through skin. The ropes had cut deep enough that her flesh had learned obedience. Her dress was torn to the waist and tied back again in a knot that wasn't hers. Dirt streaked her legs. Her hair black, long, braided once, with turquoise beads hung loose, half undone. The beads had broken, scattered like fallen bits of sky, and branded into the flesh above her elbow a mark, not of ownership by ranch or tribe, but of something worse, a man's name burned into skin as claim. For a moment, Elias didn't move. The air itself seemed to resist motion. Heat shimmered between them like a veil. Then, faintly, she stirred. One eye opened. Her voice scraped the air dry. "Don't cut the ties. If you're here for it, then do it without looking at me." Even the wind went still. Elias stood where he was, the shadow of his hat stretching toward her like a question he hadn't meant to ask. He took it off slowly and set it on the ground. The sun bit into his scalp, but he didn't flinch. "Miss," he said, the word rough from disuse, "ain't nobody doing that today." Her eyes dark as obsidian, hard as it too shifted toward his revolver, then his hands. They stopped on the long white scar down his left forearm. Recognition flickered across her face, not of him, but of the pattern men made when they carried violence too long. She turned her face away. "They all say that." He knelt beside her, careful not to cast too much shadow. The ground radiated heat through his knees. He could feel the tremor in her body, the kind that wasn't just from fever. "You're hurt bad," he said. "Fever's got you." Her silence told him she'd heard worse lies from better mouths. He pulled his pocket knife, dull but clean, and worked it under the rawhide. The knot resisted. He pressed harder. The rope gave with a dry snap, the sound small but final. She flinched. Blood came back to her hands in quick, painful color. She hissed through her teeth and turned her face toward the sun, as if it could burn the memory away. Elias tore a strip from his undershirt and wrapped her wrists. "Easy," he said, voice quieter now. "You're not property on this side of my horse." Her eyes opened again, slow and uncertain. "Property doesn't bleed," she whispered. "It just gets priced." The words landed like stones. He followed her gaze to the mark burned into her arm. The edges were swollen, infected. He didn't need to ask, but he did anyway, softly. "Kincaid?" Her lips barely moved, but he saw the name flash behind her eyes. Seth Kincaid. A man whose wealth came from land and sin in equal measure. The kind who treated women like stock and men like dirt that needed shoveling. Elias had worked for him once back, when wages mattered more than decency. He'd quit when the ledger filled with blood instead of numbers. But some debts don't stay buried. He slid an arm under her shoulders. She tensed, expecting pain. But when it didn't come, she sagged against him, spent. The heat radiated off her skin like a forge. He could feel her pulse racing beneath the fever. There are hours a body chooses to live or die. She was caught between both. He lifted her, light as regret, and carried her to Flint. The horse turned its head, snorted softly. Elias laid her across the saddle, mounted behind her, holding her steady. They rode slow. The land shimmered around them, endless and unforgiving. The sound of hooves was the only rhythm left in a world too tired for mercy. Somewhere far behind them, a crow called once, mocking the living. The cabin appeared near dusk, a squat outline against the bruised horizon. Once whitewashed, now gray as bone. A porch leaned to one side like an old man's shoulder. The roof creaked with the wind's laughter. It wasn't much, but it had walls. And walls meant something out here. Elias dismounted, carried her inside. The air was cooler, thick with the smell of wood oil, and quiet. He laid her on the cot, fetched water, and touched a wet cloth to her lips. For a long time, she didn't move. Then her fingers brushed the bandages at her wrists, tracing them as though relearning her own skin. Pain was proof of living. She exhaled, soft and shaky. "My name's Elias Boone," he said. "I keep fences standing and cattle fed. That's about all I'm good for." Her eyes opened. Her voice was weak but sure. "Nayeli," she said. A pause, as if it had to be earned. "Comanche." The word carried something wild in it, wind, fire, dignity that refused to die. Elias nodded. "You're far from your land." She looked past him toward the window, where light turned the dust to gold. "The land doesn't belong to us," she said. "We belong to it. Some men just forget their place." He didn't argue. He just sat down in the chair beside her and listened to the cabin settle the slow groan of wood, the steady rasp of wind under the door. "Safe here," he said finally, "as much as any place can be." "Safe," she repeated, eyes half closed. "That's when the earth remembers your name, not when a man says it." He almost smiled. "Maybe the earth's got a bad memory." She looked at him then, really looked, and for a breath, the room felt less empty. Outside, thunder murmured far off a storm dragging its feet across the plains. Maybe it would rain, maybe it wouldn't. Out here, promises like that came cheap. Elias leaned back, hat in his hands, and watched her drift into uneasy sleep. The lamplight flickered, soft against her bruises. He stayed awake, because men like him always did. The house creaked, the wind moaned low, and somewhere beyond the hills, the sky flashed white. Elias Boone listened to the storm gathering, not sure if it came from heaven or if it had just been following him all along. Dry Creek Mission, a ruin that forgot whether it was a church or a mouth full of broken teeth. Once, bells called settlers to prayer here. Now only vultures circled, waiting for the next confession to rot. By the time Elias Boone reached the old mission, the day had peeled itself raw. Heat shimmered off the valley floor in ghosts. The air was thick enough to drink, sour with the taste of tin and old rain. Even the flies moved slow, their wings heavy with sweat. He rode with his hat low, shirt plastered to his back, the weight of his rifle pressing like a second spine. The church stood crooked on the hill, its steeple leaning east, ashamed of what it once preached. A wooden cross jutted from the roof like a bone that refused to heal, split, blackened, half-burnt by lightning. Time had gnawed the adobe walls until they looked more like ribs than refuge. The place stank of dust, oil, and something older than sin. He swung down from his horse, boots sinking in soft dirt. His shoulders, still weeping in the heat, burned with each movement. Flint snorted behind him, stamping at invisible threats. "Stay ready, boy," Elias muttered, tying the reins to a half-rotted rail. The horse flicked its tail and whickered low, reading something in the air his rider couldn't name. Inside the doorway, shade swallowed the sun whole. The air felt cooler, but wrong too still, as if waiting for the next trespass. Pews lay shattered like bones. The altar was cracked clean through, the old hymn books gutted for kindling. Candles had melted to stubs long ago, lined along the walls like teeth in a jaw that no longer prayed. The echo of his own boots followed him, small and uncertain. He'd fought in battlefields quieter than this. Then from the dark corner of the nave came a voice, soft, slick, poisoned with familiarity. "Never thought you'd come alone." Elias froze. The words landed like a scar reopening. Slowly, he turned. Out of the shadow stepped Corwin Pike Kincaid's right hand, his shadow in human skin. The man hadn't changed much since the war, except maybe the smile. That grin had grown sharper, more practiced. His hat brim cut his face in half, but the part Elias could see was still made of bad decisions and cheap whiskey. "Old habits die hard, Captain Boone," Corwin said. Elias's jaw tightened. "Ain't a captain no more. Once was enough," Corwin chuckled, boots echoing across the stone. "You and me both. You taught me to shoot straight, remember?" "I remember teaching men to end things fast," Elias said. "You learned to make them last." Corwin laughed low, a sound like gravel in a throat. "Still carrying sermons in your holster, I see. Always figured you'd die preaching about right and wrong instead of living long enough to prove both are the same lie." Elias's eyes swept the ruin. In the cracked light from the roof, he could see stains on the altar, old blood, brown and familiar. "You talk too much for a man standing in God's wreckage." "God?" Corwin smirked. "He left this place same time we did." Silence settled again. The two men stood within it, breathing dust and history. "You think you can end Kincaid's trade?" Corwin asked finally. "He's got judges, sheriffs, the whole damned railroad in his pocket. He owns the men who own the country. Doesn't make him bulletproof." Elias's tone was even tired. "Step aside, Corwin. You don't owe him your grave." "Le." Corwin's grin faltered, but only for a breath. "You think this is about owing?" "No, Captain. This," he tapped his chest, "this is about pleasure." His hand moved, slow and sure, brushing the butt of his pistol. "I like what I do, and I plan to keep liking it." The world narrowed. Two men, two guns, one heartbeat wide enough to hold a lifetime. Outside, the wind paused to listen. Then thunder cracked. Both fired. Light tore through the church. Dust exploded from the floorboards. The echo rolled through the nave like a dying sermon. When it cleared, Corwin staggered backward, eyes wide, a red bloom spreading across his chest. He laughed once, disbelieving, broken, then fell to his knees. The pistol slipped from his fingers, clattering against stone. Elias stayed standing, though pain flared up his arm like fire. Smoke curled from the barrel of his revolver. "You should have walked," he said, voice flat. Corwin coughed, then slumped forward into the dirt. The church swallowed the sound whole. Blood ticked down from the altar edge, drop by deliberate drop. Elias exhaled, knees shaking. When he knelt beside the body, something metallic glinted beneath the dust, small, familiar. He reached for it. A brass lighter, worn but polished. The initials C.B., etched deep enough to catch the last light filtering through the roof. Caleb Boone. His brother's boy. For a moment the ruin dissolved. He saw a 12-year-old running through tall grass behind the barn, freckles bright against the dusk, chasing fireflies in jam jars. He heard his brother's voice, steady and kind. "The boy's got good hands, Eli. Don't let the world break them." And now here he was, kneeling beside proof that the world had done exactly that. Outside, the wind shifted. Clouds stacked thick as bruises over the horizon. Thunder began its slow crawl back across the sky. The smell of rain mingled with the smoke from his gun. Elias pocketed the lighter and rose, every bone in his body heavy with understanding. By the time he stepped outside, the storm had opened its throat. Fat drops hit the dust, raising the smell of life and decay in equal measure. He untied Flint and swung up, the wound in his shoulder bleeding fresh beneath his shirt. The ride back to the ranch was a blur of gray and sound. Lightning flared white against the mesas. The rain came sideways, hard enough to scrub sin clean. When he crested the last ridge, the valley below shimmered with water. The barn door banged open and shut in the gale. A lantern glowed on the porch, held steady in a woman's hand. Nayeli. Her long hair whipped around her shoulders, soaked black, yet her stance never wavered. Behind her, a scream cut through the thunder. Elisa. Elias kicked his heels and charged through the downpour. Inside was chaos. The storm had found its twin indoors. Papers littered the floor, the strongbox overturned, its secrets spilled like guts. The fire hissed in protest against the wind, and in the middle stood Caleb. He looked older than his years and younger than his guilt. Water ran off his hat brim, his coat, his face. The gun in his hand trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what he'd become. "Uncle," he said, barely a whisper, the word thin and cracked. Elias didn't reach for his own weapon. "Caleb," he said evenly, "you picked a fine night to come home." Caleb swallowed, eyes hollow. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. I was just keeping the books, told myself I was helping, tracking, counting. But I wrote their names, Uncle, every one, the missing, the taken, and now I see them when I close my eyes." "You can stop now," Elias said. "Start by setting the gun down." The storm howled outside. For a moment, it seemed Caleb might listen. Then glass shattered. A gunshot split the room. The lantern burst in Nayeli's hand, shards scattering light and oil. Eliza screamed. Elias spun, saw her framed in the doorway, red blooming fast beneath her ribs. Beyond her shoulder, through sheets of rain, a rider was already turning away, muzzle smoke trailing like a ghost. Nayeli dropped to her knees, catching Eliza before she fell. She murmured words in Navajo, low and fierce, a prayer that belonged to wind and stone. Elias was already moving, rifle in hand, fury cutting through pain like a blade through cloth. He hit the porch running. Rain slapped his face, stinging. Ahead, he caught the flash of hooves, one rider, small, desperate, cutting south toward the ridge. Elias raised his rifle, breath slowing, world shrinking to the sight's narrow ring. One heartbeat, one breath. He fired. The thunder answered. The horse stumbled, crashed into the mud, throwing its rider. The figure rolled once, then lay still. Elias approached, boots sinking deep. The shooter was just a boy 17, maybe 18, his face pale under the rain, eyes wide with terror. No tattoos, no insignia, just a child wrapped in bad orders. "He said she'd talk," the boy gasped, coughing blood. "Said we had to stop her." Elias crouched. "Who said?" The boy's lips moved, barely audible over the storm. "Kincaid." Then his eyes went dull. The rain finished what bullets began. Elias stayed kneeling for a long time, letting the storm wash over him. When he finally rose, the ranch was a dim glow in the distance, one lantern still flickering in the window. The road back felt longer than the miles allowed. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and grief. Eliza lay pale but breathing, a dark stain spreading across her dress. Nayeli worked quietly, pressing fresh cloth to the wound, her face carved from patience and fire. Caleb sat against the far wall, head bowed, gun on the floor, hands clasped like a man waiting for judgment. Elias set his rifle aside and knelt beside Eliza. "You hold on," he said softly. "You didn't come all this way to quit now." Her lips twitched, breath shallow. "The box," she whispered. "It's done," he told her. "We've got enough truth to bury Kincaid twice." Her eyes fluttered toward Nayeli. "Keep him honest," she murmured. "He's good at silence." Then her chest rose once, trembled, and stilled. her face smoothed into something like peace. Nayeli bowed her head, whispering words that made even the wind hesitate. Caleb's shoulders shook, one silent sob slipping through. Elias reached out and laid a hand on the boy's arm. "You can still fix what's left," he said. "Start by telling me where Kincaid runs his men." Caleb's voice was barely sound. "North Ridge, old freight yard. He'll come when he knows Corwin's dead." Elias nodded, slow. "Then we'll be ready." He stood, looking toward the window where dawn teased the edges of night. The rain had faded to a whisper against the panes. The first weak light of morning reached across the room, touching everything that had survived. For the first time in years, he let himself believe that decency might not be dead, just sleeping, waiting for someone stubborn enough to wake it. Outside, the storm retreated into distance. The land steamed, cleansed but not forgiven. Elias holstered his revolver, feeling its weight shift against his side. Somewhere in the quiet, Nayeli began to hum the same Navajo melody she'd sung for the dying, a sound that threaded through the room like smoke and promise. He turned toward the door. There would be another ride, another reckoning. But for now, the light through the broken window was enough to see by. And in that light, with the storm finally moving on, Elias Boone looked less like a man hunting ghosts and more like one who just learned to live with them. The storm had gone, but the land still whispered of it. The desert wore its silence like a bruise, raw and trembling under the pale stretch of morning. Clouds hung low over the mesas, their bellies heavy with the ghosts of last night's rain. The air smelled of sage and lightning, like the earth itself had been washed and left to remember. The valley lay rinsed and trembling, new as a scar still pink. Pools of water glimmered in the ruts where hooves had struck, each puddle holding a piece of the sky blue, trying to forget that it ever broke. Elias Boone stood by the porch rail, hat in hand, the brim dripping faintly, his lungs filled with the scent of wet wood, iron, and forgiveness. The storm had passed, but something inside him hadn't. His shoulder throbbed where the bullet had grazed him 2 nights ago, and his hands still shook not from pain, but from knowing he'd lived when others hadn't. Sleep had stayed away, the way mercy sometimes does. Some nights don't give rest, they give reckoning. Behind him, the cabin exhaled a slow, wooden breath. Fire glowed low in the hearth embers like dying eyes refusing to close. Its light danced across the log walls, painting everything the same color as regret. Nayeli sat by the table, her long dark hair loose down her back, streaked with rain and dust. The turquoise beads at her neck caught the glow like captured stars. Her hands were steady, binding clean cloth over Eliza's wound. The woman would live, though her eyes were hollow, washed by fear and the kind of silence that follows cruelty. Caleb slept by the door, his knees pulled up, rifle resting across his lap. Not guarding anymore, just keeping hold of something that felt like purpose. In this land, purpose was the last thing a man could lose before his soul. Outside, dawn crept over the ridge like a cautious animal. The world turned from gray to gold, one breath at a time. Elias lifted his gaze to the horizon. Steam rose from the soaked earth, curling upward, as if the land itself prayed in smoke. Somewhere out there, he knew, something was coming, the kind of quiet that walks before a man decides what he'll die for. "He'll come today," Elias said, his voice barely more than gravel and wind. Nayeli didn't lift her head. "You feel it?" He nodded. "Same way you smell rain before it breaks. Pride won't let Kincaid send another man." Nayeli tied the bandage, her fingers sure. "Then we meet him where the light first touches the land." Elias turned from the porch, his boots heavy with mud. He reached for his rifle hanging by the door, the walnut stock worn smooth from years of duty and regret. His thumb brushed over the metal, the same way one might trace a name carved into stone. "You don't have to stay," he murmured. Nayeli looked up then. Her eyes were storms, learning to be still. "This land knows who runs and who stands. I won't have it remember me wrong." Caleb stirred. "Let me go," he rasped. "He wants me, not you." Elias shook his head. "He wants a man he can break in front of witnesses. You don't give him that. You stay. You build." Caleb's jaw worked, shame flickering through him like lightning behind clouds. "I was his ledger, Uncle. his proof that good men look away for pay. If I stay while you'll stay, Elias said softly, final as prayer. Because I told you to, and because you still owe this world a fence that doesn't fall. The boy fell silent. Some commands come from blood, not words. They saddled the horses under the thinning mist. The air was cool, edged with ash and memory. Nayeli's mare breathed hard, misting the air with each exhale. Her turquoise earrings swayed as she mounted, catching the faint morning light. Elias climbed onto Flint, the old gray shifting beneath him with the patience of something that had survived too many storms. They rode out slow. Every hoofbeat was a heartbeat, every creak of leather a memory refusing to fade. The ridge rose ahead, sharp, clean, merciless against the light. At the top, the desert opened wide, endless and gold, stretching all the way to heaven's doorstep. Nayeli stopped first, her eyes narrowed. He's close. Elias followed her gaze. A single rider approached, cutting through the sun's first fire. Dust rose behind him like a bad story catching up. Seth Kincaid polished boots, silver spurs, the smell of money and rot. Even from a distance, he gleamed like a lie well told. His black horse shone as if oiled in vanity, and the gun at his hip caught the light like the fanged grin of something not human anymore. When he saw them, he slowed to a walk, posture easy, like the world still belonged to him. "Didn't think you had it in you, Boone," he called, voice smooth as whiskey, bitter as regret. "Killing my men, taking what's mine." Nayeli lifted her chin. Her voice was steady, the rhythm of the desert in it. "I'm not yours. I never was." Kincaid smiled a slow crack in a painted mask. "Every woman says that, before the world reminds her otherwise." Elias stepped forward, his shadow falling long between them. "Her truth standing here," he said, "and it don't answer to you." The wind came up, carrying dust and distance. Somewhere, a hawk screamed a sound older than law. Kincaid's smile faded. "You think killing Corwin makes you clean?" "No," Elias said, voice flat as the plain. "Just makes one less devil breathing." "Lie?" The space between them trembled. Then, in one shared breath, two guns spoke. Thunder cracked from man-made storm. Dust leapt, time folded. When the silence fell, it was so thick it could choke a prayer. Kincaid's horse bolted, leaving him sprawled in the wet dust. Elias dismounted, boots sinking deep. Kincaid's eyes were open, wild, full of disbelief, like a man who thought death was for other people. Elias knelt beside him. "You don't write names anymore," he said. "You don't mark what breathes." Kincaid tried to speak, but blood did it for him. It pooled dark in the dirt, the color of consequence. His last breath rattled like loose change in an empty pocket. The sky above was endless. It didn't care. Nayeli rode up, face unreadable. "Is it done?" Elias looked past her, toward the light breaking over the mesa. "Done enough." They buried Kincaid under a cottonwood by the stream. No marker, no words. The wind would remember better than stone. By noon, the world had turned soft again. The sun climbed, the air thick with the smell of wet sage. Eliza stood on the porch, pale but upright, her bandaged arm trembling as she held a tin cup. Caleb worked the fence line, setting each post like it was a promise. Nayeli brushed the horses in silence, humming a Navajo song that rose and fell like wind through canyon walls. Elias sat on the porch steps, rifle across his knees, not guarding, just being. His eyes traced the horizon, where the land curved into forever. The light turned amber, spilling across the valley like forgiveness that took its time. Nayeli came with coffee. She handed him a cup, her fingers grazing his, a spark that didn't belong to fire. They drank slow, the bitter taste grounding them both. "What will you do now?" she asked quietly. He thought a long time before answering. "Ride a while. Fix what still can be fixed." She nodded, eyes softening. "Will you come back?" He smiled, then tired but real. "If the wind remembers my name." "It will," she said, and the way she said it felt like a promise stitched to the sky. He rose, shoulders square, the weight of the past hanging easy now. Saddling Flint again, He moved with the slow grace of a man unburdened. Caleb came from the fields, mud to his knees. "I'll keep the place standing," he said. Elias tipped his hat. "Then it'll stand honest." He turned toward the open plain. The sky ahead burned gold, bleeding into rose and smoke. Behind him the ranch stood small but steady, a scar that healed instead of hiding. Ahead, the land rolled wide and cruel and beautiful. He rode out slow. Each hoofbeat was another word in the story no one would write. The wind rose, carrying dust, sage, and the low hum of Nayeli's song. He didn't ride for glory. He rode for peace. And peace, that day, finally rode with him. The plains stretched endless before him, gold, bone, and distance stitched together beneath the late Sunday. The storm had washed the world clean but left it fragile, trembling under the weight of stillness. Elias Boone rode through it like a man tracing the edge of a memory, every hoofbeat another echo of a story almost finished. Flint's hooves drummed slow over the drying earth. The horse's flanks shimmered with sweat, but his pace never faltered. Elias leaned into the rhythm, letting it steady his pulse. The wind pressed against his back, carrying the faint smell of sage, smoke, and the ghost of rain. Somewhere behind him, the cabin shrank into the horizon, 3 souls left to build something better from what was nearly lost. The sun was sliding low, bleeding copper across the mesa. Long shadows ran ahead of him like old debts. He wasn't sure where the trail led anymore. Maybe north, toward the river that cut through Crowland. Maybe nowhere. It didn't matter. He wasn't running, and he wasn't chasing. He was just moving, which was the closest thing to peace he knew. A coyote loped along the ridge to his right, keeping pace for a few hundred yards before disappearing into the brush. The land was alive again, cautious but awake. Crickets began their chorus early, soft and persistent, the sound of things trying again after being broken. Elias reached into his coat pocket and felt the lighter. Brass, warm from the Sunday. CB. He turned it over between calloused fingers. Caleb Boone. He didn't know why he'd taken it from Corwin's corpse. Maybe as proof that the boy had once been worth saving. Maybe as reminder that some bloodlines learn too slow. He flicked the lid open, watched the weak flame stutter against the wind, then closed it and tucked it away. Not today, he thought. Not yet. He guided Flint off the main trail toward a shallow draw where cottonwoods huddled around a trickle of water. He dismounted, stretched the stiffness from his back, and led the horse to drink. The air was thick with insects and the sweet, earthy smell of wet roots. He filled his canteen and sat in the grass, letting the quiet take him. When he looked up, the sky had turned the color of bruised fruit purple, fading into red. A hawk circled overhead, wings catching the last light. He followed its glide until it vanished beyond the ridge. The sight reminded him of Nayeli's words. The earth remembers those who choose mercy. Maybe the wind did too. He wondered if she was humming now. That low Navajo tune that had threaded through the house like smoke. The memory of it softened the edges of the day. He could almost hear her voice again, steady and certain. The land doesn't belong to us. We belong to it. He smiled faintly. Maybe belonging wasn't such a bad thing. Night crept in by degrees. The first stars winked open above the ridges, sharp and cold. Elias built a small fire, coaxing the flame with dry grass and patience. He warmed his hands, then took a piece of hard bread from his saddlebag, chewing slow. The wind hissed through the cottonwoods like the whisper of old prayers. For the first time in years, the sound didn't make him flinch. Flint grazed nearby, tail flicking lazily. The horse's steady presence felt like company. Elias leaned back against his saddle and let fatigue settle through his bones. The fire painted his face in amber light, softening the scars until they looked like maps instead of wounds. He'd carried those lines long enough to know what they meant. Not survival, but stubbornness dressed as grace. He thought of the people he'd buried, Corwin, Kincaid, men who mistook greed for strength. He thought of Eliza, pale but breathing, her final words hanging like dust in the air. Keep him honest. He's good at silence. He wondered if Nayeli would keep that promise, or if the silence would swallow them all again once he was gone. The fire popped, sending a spark into the dark. He followed it until it faded. The night was vast and merciless, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It was just the other side of the light. Sometime after midnight, he heard the faint rhythm of hooves, distant, deliberate. His hand went to the revolver out of habit. He waited, listening. The sound grew, then slowed. Out of the darkness came a rider, moving cautious but sure. A lantern swung from the saddle horn, throwing a pale glow across the grass. Elias rose, thumb resting on the gun's hammer. "Who's there?" The rider stopped a few yards away, voice low but familiar. "Name's Josiah Brand, sheriff out of White Hollow." The lantern lifted, revealing a lean man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much law and too little justice. "Been tracking smoke and trouble all morning. Figured it'd lead me to you." Elias relaxed a little but didn't holster the weapon. "Trouble's buried," he said, "under cottonwood roots west of here." Brand dismounted with a grunt, boots crunching dry grass. Heard Kincaid finally caught what he was due. Folks in town'll sleep easier, the railroad men won't. He paused, studying Elias in the flickering firelight. "You always did find a way to leave things quieter than you found 'em." "Oh, didn't plan to," Elias said. "Just kept running out of noise." Brand gave a dry chuckle. "You heading somewhere?" Elias looked toward the horizon where the stars met the black line of earth. "Not sure yet. Might ride north. Might just keep riding till I stop needing to." The sheriff nodded like he understood. "Town's talking about giving you credit. Hero talk." Elias shook his head. "Don't carve my name nowhere. Let the wind do the remembering." Brand studied him a long moment, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small folded paper. "Found this in Kincaid's office before the boys burned it. Thought you'd want to see." Elias unfolded it by firelight. Inside was a single sheet, an old ledger page, ink faded but legible. Names, ages, towns, but near the bottom, scrawled in newer handwriting, was a list of settlements marked paid, and next to one, a single word, Navajo. He felt something cold twist in his gut. "He wasn't finished," Elias murmured. Brand shook his head. "No, but his men scattered. Won't last long without the coin or the fear." Elias folded the page and tucked it inside his coat. "Maybe fear's all they ever had." Brand turned to his horse. "I'll head back at first light. Folks'll want to know you're alive." "Tell 'em I ain't sure yet," Elias said. The sheriff smiled faintly, tipped his hat, and rode off into the dark. His lantern bobbed like a slow, moving star until it disappeared. Elias sat back down, staring into the fire. The page in his pocket felt heavier than paper should. He thought of Nayeli again, her people, her song, her promise that the land remembers. Maybe it was time to see that for himself. When dawn came, he was already saddled. The light broke thin and blue, stretching long across the plains. Dew clung to the grass, jeweled and trembling. Elias tightened the cinch and swung onto Flint. His shoulder ached, but the pain was dull now, distant. He turned the horse east, toward the river and the red mesas beyond. By midday he reached the canyon rim. The land fell away beneath him, vast and golden, carved by wind and time into shapes that looked almost human. He dismounted and stood at the edge, hat in hand. The air tasted of dust and memory. Below, a ribbon of water cut through stone, glinting like a blade in the sunday. He took the lighter from his pocket one last time, flipped it open, and struck the wheel. The flame caught, small and defiant. He held it until it burned his thumb, then tossed it into the canyon. It fell, spinning, until the light vanished into the shadows. "Rest easy, boy," he said softly to Caleb, to all of them. Then he climbed back into the saddle and started down the winding path toward the river. The trail was narrow, carved into the rock by hands long gone. He rode careful, letting Flint find the footing. The wind rose around them, whistling through the canyon like a voice learning to sing again. By the time he reached the bottom, the day had turned gentle. The river whispered beside him, shallow but alive. He dismounted, knelt at the edge, and let the cold water run over his hands. The current tugged at the dust, washing it away until the skin beneath looked almost new. He thought about turning back